Great, welcome. Looks like I've got some really hardcore information architects in the room, right? Who's an information architect and admits to that? Great, great. So we're going to go a little bit off the rails today, right? I've been doing a lot of research into this, this whole area for a number of years. If you're familiar with my earlier work, content classification is a big area, a lot of different ways to look at it. Just a quick background on me, if you're not familiar with me. I've gone through a lot of different iterations, been involved with SharePoint for as long as I can remember, and really focused on information architecture from a perspective that was driven by the fact that I studied law. And so as technology continues to evolve, we see more and more convergence, and there's more and more relevance to the work that I've done. But for me, it's more relevance to the education that I went through. But it's always been sort of in the back of my mind, how do you marry the technology as it evolves to some of the core problems that we've always faced in dealing with large amounts of complex relationships and content. So I put together an agenda here to talk about information architecture in a slightly broader context, but then focusing it back on the SharePoint platform, taking into account some cloud-based issues, things that are being presented to us as information architects that's magnified because we're dealing with the constraints that are now imposed by cloud environments, right? Which were kind of masked during those phases when the on-prem model was really the one being promoted. Okay, now we're being forced to face and address some of the issues that have been there all along. So I thought it would be useful to start at that sort of broad perspective. Now, keep in mind that I know that there are a lot of different ways to approach this problem, right? And that we're all still trying to grapple with what the best approach will be. So don't take this as sort of a set-in-stone idea. It's an evolving set of ideas. But I wanted to look at where we are with regard to content analysis methodologies as constrained by SharePoint. Okay? It's not just a broad theory, how do we analyze content? There's a lot of different ways to look at that, but SharePoint and cloud in particular puts a certain focus on it that brings out some pretty interesting phenomena. And through my investigations, and my desire to find some sort of repeatable methodology that would satisfy a lot of the different issues that we face in dealing with users and dealing with IT, the dependency structure matrix analysis approach seems to offer a lot of promise in terms of being able to quantify and more carefully and more importantly, repeatably, go through an analysis, go through a methodology that will yield better results with the resulting architecture. And I'll talk more about what that means, what I mean by that, what the better results are. And then to share a few observations on this process as I've been going through it, and some future directions regarding tooling. I came across this picture which kind of captures it all for me, right? And I put this little, is it an oxymoron? Is it possible to do information architecture in a SharePoint environment, right? What this represents for me is kind of where we are. We've gotten to where we are without any kind of methodology. We've gotten there without any kind of really rigorous, theoretical approach to classifying information. And we've gotten there through a lot of different investments, a lot of investment in trying to get that information that we've been living with and gathering in various means through different kinds of tools. Email, a big part of that, right? Not just document creation tools, which are continually evolving. The marketplace is pretty brutal in the sense that it's presenting us with a lot of different architectural ideas, right? Some of them are winning, some of them are not. But the result is that we can't really touch what's there, right? It's there, right? We don't like it, but it's there. So this kind of captures that idea, so that it's very complicated, it's layered, it's continually evolving, and we can't really do much with it. So how do we get out of that bind? Some key considerations to put on the table here are, the core ideas in terms of value, the value proposition for well-organized information, right? We have to know where to put it, or at least rely on some system to put it in a place where it can be useful. And we have to know how to get it, right? We have to put it in place in a way that allows us to get it in ways that we can't predict, right? We don't know what those search queries are going to look like. So how do we decide today what metadata we need that will support a particular group that's focused on a particular set of functions, right? They're focused on an objective. We don't know what that objective is today. We can predict maybe, but we know also that there are going to be different groups using the same content to support different kinds of functions, right? Am I right? Okay, you've seen this, okay? How do you design an information architecture that supports multiple workflows, right, with the same content? Okay, so putability is, okay, if we have a methodology that allows us to tag that information, maybe we can trust that we're going to put it away in a way that allows it to be retrieved efficiently to support that particular workflow. Key example, you've got a sales team working in conjunction with an IT team that's working in conjunction with a testing team, right? And they're all working with pieces of the same content, right? Or you're working with a compliance team, okay? They're looking at that same content. When they hit that content database, they're hitting it from different perspectives, right? In order for those perspectives to be served, right, the metadata has to be rich enough for them to present queries that will retrieve the information that is relevant to what they're doing. So how do we design an information architecture that achieves all those goals, right? And there are obvious aspects to that, right? It's not just that we need to support humans in that findability exercise. More and more, we're going to have to support non-humans, right, with a set of rules that have been hopefully tuned to the need, but that allows those processes, those workflows to operate in an efficient manner. Okay? So let's boil it down to kind of where we are in terms of what we have to do. Like that big jumble of wires, there's a lot of information out there. So migration is always going to be on the table. Right? We're always going to have to deal with how do we get the content that's out there that was produced in a way that wasn't really systematic, and how are we going to get that information now into a more structured form, whatever form we decide that is. Okay? Well, there are two basic strategies. And I focus on legacy content, and through the slides you'll see, this term legacy ECM systems. They're there. So you may have open text, right? You may have a mixture of legacy ECM systems that came into being at a time when there was still a lot of content, but there was not as much attention being placed on these particular constraints that we're dealing with today. So the two basic strategies that I've divided this into, you can have a migration strategy where you say, okay, we know we've got to come up with a new information architecture. So why not do that when we migrate the content? Why not pay the price of the IA cost when we do the migration? So that's what the migration strategy is. We say we're going to create a new information architecture, and we're going to leverage whatever metadata migration tools are available in the tool that we've decided on to do the migration. So different tools provide different capabilities for migrating metadata, for mapping it in to your new information architecture. But it begs the question, where's that new information architecture going to come from, right? And then there's some key pros and cons, right? So if we're going to rely on the migration point in time to do our new IA, then we don't really have to stress the tool because we're going to create a whole new architecture. So we don't have to put in special rules to map those over, right? We don't really need to worry about the connectors and adapters if we're trying to, bridge two environments. We're not. We're going to have a totally new environment, so we don't have to worry about that stuff, which can consume a lot of time and effort, right? On the con side, one of the things to observe is that all of these legacy systems have developed their own terminology to talk about the information architecture, right? It's specific to that product, right? OpenText has a whole different semantic network that they build around information than, say, file shares or even SharePoint. So when we take a migration strategy which has some benefit, we also have to keep in mind that we're going to have to come up with a new terminology or deal with the terminologies that are specific to that particular platform. Flip side of that is to try to have a hybrid strategy where you leave all of those wires as they are and you build a new system alongside it, and then you use the rules to sort of bridge those two environments. You leave OpenText up and running. You rely on some sort of API to connect your new environment to the old when you need it. Let's say you can identify certain categories of information that definitely belong in that older system. Maybe SharePoint doesn't have the structures that you need to manage that content, right? Maybe they're working fine inside the old system and you don't really want to touch it. You don't know how it works, but it's okay because people are happy with it. So that's what I'm calling a hybrid strategy, where you manage both systems with your new information architecture. You accommodate the differences in your information architecture, and you then rely on that, mass of information and its rules to work the way it's been working for the last 15 years. Okay? These are two very viable approaches. It's just important to understand the differences. And why am I talking about it this way? Well, each of these strategies has an impact on both the putability and the findability issues, right? On the putability side, if you choose a migration strategy, right, you've got to map those rules, which may not be that well documented, right? They're just there. You've got to do a mapping exercise. There's an additional cost to map them onto your new information architecture environment, right? And that means that you have to really understand the differences in capabilities between those technology platforms, okay? Not only are you having to map the rules, but you're also having to map the repositories. They have different capabilities as well. Good example is the Record Center, right? The Record Center, repository-based strategies, it has rules that are tied to the location, right? But maybe your users are clamoring for more in-place preservation type support, which doesn't rely on location, right? So you got to, but maybe your existing legacy does have sort of location-based rules, which most of them do. So how are you going to map these over? You've got to think about what does that repository look like. Again, a technology-driven decision matrix. The risk here, big risk, is that those existing obsolete patterns that are baked into that old ECM system, you're going to now move them over. You're going to have the same problem from an IA perspective that you had before. You're not gaining anything, even though the migration strategy was supposed to insulate you from that. So there are forces working for and against you here with regard to rules that determine how content goes in. Hybrid strategy, right? You've got a fresh, new information architecture. You're leaving the old rules in place, so you're not mapping them over, okay? And you can take the approach of just saying, well, special content will go in there and leave it alone. So you've got some advantages, right, from an IA perspective of choosing a hybrid strategy. Okay? Most of the new content goes into the new system, and gradually the old content stays in the repository. Might work, might not. But there are other issues to consider. What about findability? With a migration strategy, again, you're mapping rules, but for a different reason here. You're mapping metadata properties over. E-discovery is a big selling point for a lot of these old systems, but they do it their own way. So you've got to consider, particularly with e-discovery, in your new environment, do you have all the features that you're going to need, right? So is there a mapping from an open text environment into SharePoint, right, for e-discovery, right, that people have been relying on? Compliance has been relying on it, legal's been relying on it. How much is it going to cost you, how much time to compensate for the missing features in SharePoint today, okay? Particularly if you're moving to the cloud, search is, evolving, right? But say you have multiple data stores and things like that you have to deal with that Microsoft hasn't quite gotten to yet, right? And if you look at a hybrid strategy, you've got to take the same idea, but you've still got the same basic problem, right? So why am I talking about this? Well, wouldn't it be great if we could develop an information architecture approach or strategy that was technology agnostic, that did not depend so much on the specific technology investments that have been made, right? Looking at it from a different perspective, what if we assume the worst case and say that we're going to have to do a hybrid strategy, but we don't know what technologies are going to be provided, especially given the fact that they're continually evolving, right? Search is evolving, e-discovery is evolving, the way that people are approaching compliance is evolving, even the compliance rules are evolving, right? Architecture, by its definition, is going to be pretty broad scope in time. Information architecture investments, then, in order to maximize them, the more technology specific they are, the less scalable it's going to be. Okay? You're going to have to reinvest and reconsider, and it's already a hard sell. Right? It's very difficult, I'm finding it, at least as a consultant in the IA space, to convince people to put the money down for, we know the value. I was just telling a colleague at breakfast, and I'm from Florida, and the governor of Florida, you may know, you may not know, has just basically banned the use of the term global warming, right? And there was a case, very interesting case, where a public worker, someone who worked for the government in Tallahassee, had to use the word global warming to describe a session that he attended in the Congress. He had to report on it. It was his job, right? And he couldn't report on it because he was told, if you use these words in any written or verbal communication, you will be punished. And he was punished, right? So it became a big thing, right? But it's like, if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. And that's kind of where people are with IA, right? I know you're telling me that the more investment I make in IA, the better off I'm going to be, but I'm just not willing to admit it yet. I'm just not willing to. I can't sell it, right? So that's kind of where we are. So given the fact that we've got to make these hard choices with IA, what if we took an approach that allowed us to leverage those choices by not focusing so much on the technology, but focusing more on the business use case? Right? Focusing more on what's actually happening to the content. Okay? If we take a technology-specific approach, which is kind of where we've been, we think about IA and SharePoint, we think about things like content types. Right? We think about things like record centers, content organizers. Right? These are the terminologies that have been given to us by the technology platform. Well, like that, any information management platform that you choose is going to come with its own terminology, its own data structures, its own concepts that it's layering on top of that same body of information, right? And the problem is that if you base your information architecture development on that technology, it's going to be skewed toward that technology, okay? We're going to talk in terms of content types when we're sitting in front of people that have no idea and they really don't care what kind of data structure it is, as long as it achieves the goal that they're interested in, right? Not just interested in, that they're being paid to implement, right, to do. So if we choose a technology-agnostic approach, We want to borrow terminology from the business scenario. We want to use concepts that the people understand and connect with. We want to ignore platform-specific features as much as possible, or we want to create an architecture that considers all of those structures so that we can handle our mappings depending on what strategies we're using. And the goal here is to improve scalability of our investment and enable us to adapt readily to new platforms as they emerge. And just to give you some greater clarity around this, consider just a file share. We're migrating content from a file share. And let's say we have a general structure of our strategy. We want to find out who's interacting with the content, what are they doing with it, right? And how can we group the content in such a way that we can identify it and talk about rules related to it, right? That's going to be our general approach. But with file shares, to identify the roles, what are we looking at? We're looking at access control lists. We're looking at maybe organizational roles, right? Because of the limitations of this technology, right? It can't really give us much more information than what we have there. If we're looking at activities, well, what do people do in file shares in order to manage complexity? They create very inventive names for folders, right? You go to a law firm, they're going to have a lot of numbers in the names, okay? You go to another group, they're going to have a different approach, right? But it's all going to be around naming conventions that somehow are supposed to capture the detailed information about workflows that's embedded in the mind of a person who's been working there for 25 years, right? Functional groupings, maybe, if they've been really good about organizing their folder structures. Identifying types is going to focus mainly around deduplication, maybe special groups that have been given special permissions for certain folders and things like that. So the terminology is fairly limited. And so, you can see that the challenges that we're trying to solve are being driven by the file share technology. Let's look at OpenText for a second, right? You've got more functionality, and so your roles identification is now going to be taken more from what that platform provides. It gives you more flexibility in terms of defining groups of users, setting up organizational roles within the context of the information management. But then you've got other terminologies, other things to work with. You've got workspaces. You've got a richer set of functionality, right? Different set of components that you can work with. So if you're defining an information architecture in terms of OpenText, the seductive response is to maybe use some of these concepts, right? To build your rules around where information is located, and is it in a workspace, and what's the relationship between one workspace and another, between roles that are interacting with those things. And like that, SharePoint also does the same thing, right? We're familiar with a lot of these terms, right? We've got these things to work with. We've got same strategy, but different impact and different set of challenges, okay? All of these things flowing back up to this concept of, or this overriding goal of how do we develop an information architecture that insulates us from these kinds of platform dependencies, okay? So, one more observation before we get more into the meat of this talk. For better or worse, right, these legacy systems tend to present information architecture in a very idealized form. And we can reduce that to, I like to sort of reduce things to terms. So this taxonomic approach is this idealized behavior that we've all become familiar with, right? What we want to do when we're doing information architecture, we want to take a very top-down, concept-heavy structure, right? That says we have, even if you look at it from a SharePoint perspective, we've got the document at the top, right? And then we sort of break that down into specialized kinds of documents, right? We're going to use content types. We've got legal documents. We've got medical documents. We've got HR documents. We've got these big bucket categories with certain metadata associated with them. And we can go down another level, right? Very idealized, but also very static. right? It's our concept today of what that should look like. And then that has to, at some point, be forced on users, right? And the users that are in a very structured environment, let's say they're working for a telco, or they're working for an energy company, right? Okay, it's pretty regimented already, so okay, that might work, except for the documents that they want to share when they're developing information that flows into the system, right? So there's information that we're not dealing with that's outside of the structure, but once we get into this structure, and you see this a lot with records management, where you've got a well-defined division between, official records and, sort of unstructured content. That idealized view of the world may work okay, but more and more we're being pushed toward a different world, okay, where a folksonomic approach is more appropriate. It's the one that people will accept. But it forces us into thinking about information architecture from a different perspective, where that top-down conceptual view is almost guaranteed to be obsoleted within, 8 months, 9 months, something like that, right? As new needs arise, new pressures arise, through new workflows arise, okay? One thing that we observe is that if unstructured content, we're not talking about databases now, but if unstructured content is more organized according to how it's going to be used, people will find it more easily. People know how to find it more easily, right? They're more comfortable with those types of structures. And we also observe that the ability to classify information is a very subjective process, okay? And more depends on the context in which content is being used, right? Do you buy that? Sounds okay so far? Right? These are just observations through the process, right? Why are people not adopting SharePoint solutions so readily is because the complexity is causing us as information architects in the IT area to push onto them classifications that don't make sense. Okay, here's another way to look at that. If you map this out, and you can see, like from structured to unstructured, specialists, meaning information specialists, someone who knows a lot about that kind of content, toward the layman who doesn't know as much about the metadata and the structure, right? This line here represents kind of the boundary where traditional ECM systems fall. Okay? There's some very structured content that is easy to classify, okay, that requires a lot of knowledge. But more and more we're seeing that content is falling outside of that realm, where it's more unstructured, and more lay people are being asked to classify it, right? Who don't really like to classify things, okay? And even if you force them to do it, the stress prevents them from doing it, right? There have been some really interesting studies produced by tool vendors. Concept searching, you might be familiar with, and auto-tagging. They have an auto-tagging product. And they studied how users interact with content. And they found some interesting things is that if you ask the same group of users to classify the same group of documents at 9 a.m., right? And then you ask them again at 5 p.m., you'll get different classifications, right? The same people with the same documents, different classification. Now think about, and these are people who are highly trained information people, right? They know how to do classification. You put that into the context of most users, not only will they not classify it the same way, they'll start pushing it back against the whole system, right? There's another product where, it asks users to just drag and drop their email, okay? You give them a set of folders. You say, okay, when you get an email that should be kept, right, drag it into the appropriate folder. Right? And some of these tools are better than others. Some of them will reach out to SharePoint, see the content types, bring them back, construct the dialogue dynamically, and show that to the user. They will do it a few times, right? But then after a while, they'll just choose the first option. It's documented. They will just choose the first item in the list, and that's it, okay? So you have to adapt to that strategy. So this classification stress is a real thing. You know, it's not something that we can ignore and assume that some rule or some law within the organization is going to get them to do it, okay? So we need something else. We need something to rise to the challenge of doing information architecture in a way that is more scientific. I'm reluctant to really use the word, but you know, something more predictable, something more in the direction of looking at the content and figuring out how to organize it based on how it's going to be used. Right? That was kind of the driving force behind this notion of using something like a dependency structure matrix. Okay? So, what would that look like? Well, we want to try to reduce subjectivity. You know, the point I just raised. You know, it's a highly subjective process of classifying information. Right? So how do we reduce that subjectivity element so that we can have a more predictable outcome? Another goal is the one that I started with. Multiple technology platforms we can assume are going to always be in the mix. So whatever methodology we choose has to be able to support and adapt to multiple environments, hybrid environments, on-prem plus cloud, right? One set of tools versus another. The vendors are always going to be fighting over, you know, your mind share as an information architect. What are you going to be able to support with your methodology? How do you leverage those existing ECM investments and at the same time support newer ones that may have to coexist with the old ones, right? Things are going to win, things are going to lose, things are going to be phased in, phased out. Information architecture for a particular organization shouldn't be changing, okay? You're still an energy company. You're still dealing with the same kind of information. What should it matter that you've chosen OpenText over an HP trim versus, you know, something else, right? What should it matter? It really shouldn't. And then, finally, how do you keep end users engaged in an iterative process that keeps the information architecture relevant to what they have to do every day? All right? Okay? Well, one approach is to try to capture, in a technology-agnostic way, inherent relationships between content and the activities that people are asked to perform. And role activity modeling is a term that's been used in different contexts. I sort of hijacked it here, and I'm calling it role activity dependency modeling, where you start with a process that is surprisingly approachable by most people, lay people as well as information people, where you identify roles that they're playing in relation to content, not their organizational roles. Right? First thing you do when you sit down with a group of people, and I often conduct these sessions with, you know, a cross-section of people from a company, and I say the word role, and they suddenly get caught in this political battle that says, well, that's not your role, that's my role. That's, you know, it's not the organizational role. It's what role are you playing in relation to content, right? And within those roles that you're playing, what are the responsibilities within that role for managing that content, right? What activities are you being asked to perform with that content, right? If you take that approach, people pick it up pretty quickly. They understand because they're being asked to do these things. So you just can ask them to enumerate, okay, what are you doing? What do you do with this information? And what information do you need in order to do these things? You're basically asking them to enumerate. You're not asking them to classify. It's a very important distinction. People are happy to enumerate. They're happy to say what they do, right? They're effusive, okay? you get them together in a room and they start to realize, oh, I didn't realize you were doing that with this information. So there's an information sort of cross-pollination that happens. But bottom line is it's fairly easy to get this information from people who are now in the organization. They're not information people. They're just doing their jobs. And you end up with a map that relates content to the tasks, the discrete tasks and activities that are actually happening within each department. You can take one department, another department at a time, 2 or 3 days, and you can end up with a map that shows you how the relationship exists today between the content and the activities. Why is that useful? Here's an example, right? Now, you'll be able to get these slides, so you take a look at this from a certain perspective. Now, I'm imposing a discipline on mind mapping here, and my discipline is very simple and consistent, okay? And I've used in colors to distinguish content from activities and roles, right? So there's one role here, right? The engineering technology role, and I've even assigned a resource to it. And here is one place where the choice of tool for doing your mapping is kind of important. I've chosen, in this case, to use Mind Manager. There's another tool that's pretty useful called Xmind, right, you may be familiar with. But basically, it's a mind mapping tool. And here I'm saying, I lost my pointer. In this engineering technology role, there's certain activities and responsibilities that flow with that. And I'm using a simple discipline of, using verb phrases to maintain the technology wiki, for example. And I'm using the Mind Manager call-out mechanism to say that in maintaining the technology wiki, a piece of content is being created, right? So these basically mean that content is being created by this activity. Okay? And I'm using these red arrows to say that content is being consumed by the other activity, right? That's it. There are no other rules. You can't connect content to roles, right? It is impliedly connected to that because of the activities to which it's attached. And you have this simple rule that content is either being produced or consumed by activities. And you don't impose any more rules because after that it gets too complicated for most people to see. So using this mind mapping tool, you can go in front of any kind of audience and they will understand, just by understanding those rules, how to read this map. And they can contribute, and they can debate, and they can come up with unique views on how specific pieces of content are related to specific activities. You can even break the activities down into smaller and smaller activities, and you can order them just by putting little numbers on them, that this activity has to come before the other. So you have basically all the things that you need to capture the information that's locked into the heads of people about what their roles and activities are and what content do they need in order to produce those to do those things, and what content do they produce when they're doing those things. Now it gets interesting because that information gives you dependency maps, right, that you don't have to ask for. You can just derive them from the map. So for example, if content flows into a task and that task is associated with certain users and content flows out of that task, then obviously there's a dependency that's been defined between the content elements, okay? We're saying that there's a definite relationship between content A and content B by virtue of its association with that task, right? There's implied relationships between the users. There's binding going on here that you can, in a more systematic way, flesh out the differences and the dependencies between them. By mapping these dependencies on first blush, you get some benefits. You can start thinking about workspaces, workflows, UI environments that support those users by presenting that content at the certain stage, right? You've bound that together. You can ignore everything else when you're designing that interface, because you've been told by the users that this is the information that they need, right? And you can track it for the purpose of supporting non-human interactions with that content, okay? You can further analyze that content to figure out what metadata is going to be there, and you can look for bottlenecks and things like that. So there's some obvious things that come out just from doing the dependency modeling, right? And you can see here in this representation the same basic idea, right? You can think about that and come up with, you know, additional components of this technique, right? But you can go even further. I don't know if you're familiar with the design structure matrix methodology or the dependency matrix methodology. How many have seen this stuff before? Yeah, it's kind of the response I get when I talk to information architects. If you talk to manufacturing people, they immediately know what you're talking about because it's been in use for quite a while, right? For dealing with complexity, right? Large-scale assembly lines, like for Boeing, right? You're building a plane, and you've got these huge interdependent relationships going on. Even large complex software systems, right? MIT started pushing the envelope a little bit by applying it to software architecture, where you can have a tool that reads a huge Java database, right? All this code, and it figures out what the relationships are and then presents that information in a more compact form by using a dependency structure matrix. And it's a very simple idea, a very powerful concept. It's a compact representation of complex dependent relationships. And it has some basic features. And so here's a simple matrix. And you can see that whatever the system components are that you defined, you lay them out horizontally and vertically. So the rows and the columns you see are the same. You're talking about the same entity. And you're basically reading from left to right. In this case, type C depends on type D and type E, right? You're putting something in that cell to indicate that there's a dependency between them, right? Very simple. And so you could read that whole matrix that way. Now, if you start looking at some of the research that's being done on DSMs, a few writers reverse that and read from top down, but that's being driven primarily by their implementation of a tool. I find that it's more natural to read from left to right. So type C depends on types D and E, type D depends on type B, type F depends on type D. The other interesting phenomenon here is that there's this thing called an identity diagonal, where you're dealing with the same item in both row and column. And the interesting part of this is, out of the terminology for DSMs, this was structured usually with these not being types, but being activities, tasks. Tasks that are sequentially ordered from left to right. If these tasks are sequentially ordered from left to right, anything above the diagonal represents a problem, a cyclical relationship, because you're defining a dependency on something that doesn't yet exist. Okay? That's used very heavily in the DSM literature. We can use it a little bit here, as I'm going to show you in a second, as one way to identify potential problems and bottlenecks between content elements. But instead of mapping activities, we're going to map content. Right? So we have to figure out which content elements are essential to the process. We have to figure out which content elements are common to all processes. These are kind of the benefits of using this approach. We're looking for bottlenecks, and we're identifying explicitly where the content's coming from, where it's originating. Is it originating from a particular activity? Is it originating from outside of the system? Is it flowing out of the system? Is it flowing into particular activities, etc.? But basically, the steps are going to be the same. We identify those content elements, however we choose to do that. You can use role activity modeling or some other technique. We want to construct a matrix and then assign weights. So in that previous example, you saw just a dot. We're going to use a number to identify the strength of the dependency, how many dependencies exist between a particular set of elements. And then we're going to take advantage of another idea, ways in which we can transform that matrix algorithmically to highlight other dependencies. Then it gets really interesting, okay? Then we can do refactoring and look for critical metadata. There are two basic patterns. There's a third that we don't really deal with much, where you have those cycles, but you have either a dependent serial relationship or independent relationship. You can see over here there's no dependencies. And instead of activities, we're going to take the content elements that have been identified in the role activity model, we're going to put them in a matrix and map their weighted dependencies, right? Now, depending on how well you factored out those dependencies, it can be more onerous or less onerous to construct this matrix. Naturally, I'm looking to automate that in some way. One of the reasons I chose Mind Manager is that it has a pretty extensive API. So you can actually take that map and reduce it to XML and generate an Excel spreadsheet or some other thing that allows you to see these things, right? Not that easy to do, but not that difficult as well. But the idea is that you get this matrix with weighted dependencies in them, just like before. And then you start playing with the matrix. So one transformation is very simple. You can simply order them in reverse order of weight, right? You sum up the weights in a row and sort them. When you sort the rows, you sort the columns, and the numbers start moving, okay? In this case, I've just sorted it so that at the bottom types A and D, right? And then E, G, moving on up the line, right? And then you start to look for patterns that exist now in the transformed matrix, right? One easy pattern is elements that have no dependencies, right? The row is completely empty. So when that happens, you've basically identified a building block, right? A document template. You've identified boilerplate content. You've identified a base content type, right? Something that will hold metadata, right? Free of dependencies, okay? It's just like a class in C# or something like that that you can then use to build more complex solutions, right? Another thing is you can obviously see identifying types with no dependence, right? Either they don't feed directly into any task, right? Because there are no dependence, or they feed into tasks that don't produce any content, right? So these types of elements have marginal importance for your architecture, right? They're there, but they don't really contribute to your information architecture, right? They're irrelevant for the purposes of this analysis. They may still be relevant for the purposes of some other analysis. As soon as you introduce a dependency through a task or activity that someone remembers, right? They revisit the map. They say, oh yeah, I put additional information into that document so that Joe in accounting will know what to do, right? That happens, right? Once that happens, it introduces a dependency, and all of a sudden this is no longer irrelevant. It's relevant. So let's say you had a tool that plugged in to Mind Manager, and you were using Mind Manager to communicate with Joe and Alex, who just told you there's a new rule that they forgot to tell you before, right? You've already gone into production, and now, okay, you've got this dependency, you map it back in, you see this, okay, well, wait a minute, this used to have nothing in that column, now it's got a 2, right? What does that mean? Well, maybe it has some impact on how the information now needs to flow through your system. It's more of a dynamic architecture, less of a static architecture that you would have been lulled into building before. Okay? Cyclical patterns emerge if you apply different types of orderings, right? So you can see this is one ordering that we've used, okay? So if you just sort them, you can easily identify cyclical patterns using the same basic approach that the manufacturing applications use, because you've got this implied sequence if you're associating content with sequential tasks. But you can also apply different algorithms. You don't have to just sort the rows. You can have aggressive algorithms that look for components, right? It sorts them based on how closely tied they are, right? Which is an interesting way to look at the transformation matrix, is that you can have an algorithm that looks for tight coupling, tries to push the numbers below the diagonal. There are all kinds of algorithms. If you search the literature, you'll find there's lots of ways to transform a DSM. And some of them have usefulness in this context. The two that really, I think, are useful are just the simple sort and the component algorithm, because this tight coupling shows you shared metadata, right? Opportunities to share metadata. And there you're talking about, in the SharePoint world, document sets or cases or things like that, where you want to take advantage of inherent close affinity between different content elements. And I call those functional groups. These are groups of content, groups of documents, compound documents, that idea, where it's specifically supporting a particular set of scenarios. Finally, to apply the model to a CMS, if you're lucky and you've got all of those relationships defined in some XML file somewhere, then it should be easy to map that in, right? You can use PowerShell, you can use some other tool to then extract those relationships and apply them into your CMS. In the SharePoint world, you're going to get a lot more benefit if you apply it to the term store than you do to the content type, right? And more, the tools that are being used to define taxonomies are relying on the term store, right? So, that means that you can change the relationships, right? You can apply them across farms. There's a great tool that I use called CLM. It's from Collabware, based in Canada. And they have a fantastic tool that is driven off of the term store that can apply content classification rules across multiple farms and things like that. You're getting the advantage of basically service-oriented classification, okay? Not enough time to go into the detail, but this is also kind of an interesting area of warranting more research. To summarize, how am I doing on time? A few minutes? 2 minutes? All right. Just to summarize the methodology, you need to construct a content model, ideally one that's technology agnostic. Because in order to feed the DSM, you need to have discrete content elements. The roles are less important than the activities, but the roles help to connect with users in terms of what they're doing with what content. The key piece is content that flows into and out of those activities, because that gives you your dependency structure. The other thing is that you definitely want to engage end users in the whole process, because that keeps that information relevant. Then within that structure, you want to figure out what patterns and shared metadata opportunities are there. You can use sorting and transformations to focus in on particular patterns. And you can figure out which content elements to focus on and which ones you can ignore. And then finally, you want to take that mapping and then apply it in as consistent and repeatable a manner as possible. Ideally, if you can automate that, you'll be better off, because just the sheer volume of these things, in 3 days, you can bring out a ton of information in terms of, the size of these maps, right? They can get very large very quickly. And you have to, because you're engaging with people in a dialogue, and they're remembering something the first time, and then you sit with them again, and they remember more, and it becomes more and more interrelated. In practice, it's still very manageable. because if you're using a tool like Mind Manager, you're just drawing arrows and moving them around. It's very easy. You're not getting caught up in the creating of that. And if you're just following a few rules that says, content has to be connected to activities, it doesn't take long to master, and you end up with consistent information. You end up with, however you want to parse that information. Even if you use Xmind will save all that information in a file, and you can process it really easily. And you can then bring out selectively the information that you need to think about how you're going to configure your stuff. So a few final observations. Business processes are content-driven, should be obvious, like order processing, for example. Content flows sequentially through those business processes. Most of the time is spent in a workflow, if you're thinking about workflow, is going to be spent waiting. So, it makes sense to structure your information architecture more in line with business processing than with just taxonomy. Okay? Another set of observations. Content dependencies are always linked to tasks. And if you can transform the DSM, you're going to find that shared tasks where people are involved in, multiple people are involved in those tasks, they're going to show up as affinity groupings within your DSM. Right? That helps you in two ways. One is that you know that those affinity groupings are going to be linked to collaborative tasks. So if the users haven't revealed that to you, but you're seeing an affinity grouping, you can now present it back to the users to get more detail. Right? Something that would otherwise have been missed, the DSM is now going to show you that this is a dependency that's there. Right? Now let's go back and query the users and get more detail, because we know that these particular content elements. Similarly, if you see rows that have no dependents or no dependencies, that's an opportunity to come back to your users and verify that in fact that exists, because the way they've expressed those activities, the way they've expressed the subjective element can then be, sort of systematically removed, force them to validate in a way that they will accept, right? It opens the door to a richer dialogue between you, the information architect, and the audience that you're serving, okay? So you're looking for, it's an iterative process, so you're looking for opportunities to continually refactor the content, right? Finally, one of the benefits that you get from having this refactoring is that your workflows, your business processes become more efficient. Example that I gave before, statement of work. We have a sales group that's collaborating with the IT group on the development of a shared document or set of documents, this statement of work, right? Let's say there are many sections within that statement of work, and different groups are working on different sections, right? And you use this technique and you break it down and figure out the dependencies that are between them, right? And you find that they are sharing the statement of work, but they're not sharing all the different sections because they're working on them at different times. That means they can work on them simultaneously, right? Whereas before, they have to check out the whole statement of work, locking out everybody else who could be working on it, right? Now, you've refactored it into functional groups within that content. You can break the statement of work into pieces. You know, because you've analyzed it, that this set of content is supporting these activities, while this set of content is supporting these. And you've now identified an opportunity to make that workflow more efficient, because these two groups can now collaborate safely on different sections of the same compound document. Whereas before it was one statement of work, now it's split as a document set that has different elements that you construct at the end. You can see, before investing a lot of time and energy into building it, exactly how that content is going to be related. Okay? Back to some basics. True scalability, we know, depends on having rich building blocks. What we haven't had in IA has been building blocks that are tuned to the business process or tuned to the organization. Now we are moving into an area where we need to provide services that are specific to a particular functional group in an organization. We need to provide building blocks in the content realm that support those those kinds of factorings, right? Because the content and the business process have to go together. We have to define content that supports those business processes. Those business processes are being split up and distributed into the cloud as services. We need to be able to now do the same thing with our IA approach, right? Typically, these domain-specific workflow activities are embedded with the content, right? Now we have to break that out and allow them to be able to serve different pieces. And that sort of leads us to a whole other set of discussions that, related to how do we create information architecture services, okay? That's basically it, right? We have this approach is one step in the direction of making that process much more repeatable, systematic, non-subjective, all those things, okay? Right at the end, right? We're good? All right, so if you want more information, I'm going to start a blog series on this whole idea. I have a company website as well as my blog, which is johnholliday.net. Mindjet.com, xmind.net for tools. There's another tool out there that I didn't mention before. It's called Lattice. Interesting work being done, but really focused on decomposing large software systems, right? Not directly applicable, although they have created a tool that allows you to you can import your XML maps into it, and you can apply custom algorithms, right? The big advantage that I see with Lattice is that they've already created a component transformation algorithm out of the box. It's already done. It's written in Java, right? You can create custom algorithms if you want, and it's an open API. Not cheap, but still might be a useful tool if you want to continue this research, okay? You can open up for a quick set of questions if you have them. Otherwise, thank you for coming.